could the knight beat Deltarune? Now, some of you asked for Chapter 2, so I have decided to give you Chapter 2. Now, the thing is, unlike Chapter 1, all the other chapters are extremely longer, so if we're going to continue the story, we are going to have to split this into parts. Now, Chapter 2 is not as long as Chapter 3 or Chapter 4, but it is still long to its own right. So this video will be part 1. Now, before we begin, I am going to have to remind you all of the rules of this what if. Now, the rules of this what if is that the knight, well, since the knight is in the world of Deltarune, they are allowed to have all their gear and all their weapons and all their abilities, but they are not allowed to have new weapons like from the shops or from any other point in the story. Now, the knight is allowed to have items from shops, but mostly healing items. Other than that, I will not allow. But with the rest of the rules, it should be fairly the same as the first part, but I am going to change one rule, and that is the charm rule. Now, the charm rule was that I wouldn't allow the knight to give away their charms to the other members of the party because, well, knowing how their character personalities and, well, mainly how they behaved in the first chapter, mainly Susie, I didn't allow them to have charms. But since Chapter 2 is where everyone is more cooperative, I decided and was partially and a part of me was convinced by my friends to change this rule. Now, since I am changing this rule, I will only allow 3 charms to be given per video. Now, 3 charms is because, well, there's 3 members. So each member would only be allowed to have 1 charm. Actually, come to think of it, it's not going to be per video, it's going to be per chapter. So, any charm that I will give them for a chapter, they are stuck with this charm until the chapter ends. Now, other than that, we may begin. Where we last left off was at the ending of Chapter 1. Now, Toriel was kind enough to allow the knight to stay with her and Chris until the knight finds their way back home. Now, since the ending of Chapter 1 was Chris ripping out their soul, originally Chris was alone in their bedroom. But since the knight is staying with Chris and his mother and their mother, the knight would of course be a silent witness to this, because I don't think the sound of a person ripping out their soul would be a very quiet one. So, unfortunately for the knight, they do not have a voice to cry suffering. So, they would have to lay in the bed while witnessing the scene. Now, after that, the things would go fairly normal. Toriel would wake up, go to the kitchen, and she would discover that the pie that she was baking has been ransacked by an unknown culprit. And the evidence was Chris's knife. So, of course, she would believe that Chris was the one to do it. Now, she would, of course, go to their room and, of course, wake both of them up for school. Yes, both of them. Now, since Toriel is a teacher, she has to go to work at school and she's a teacher. Now, here's the thing, right? I believe that even though the knight is a newcomer and, well, a person that's not from around here, I believe that Toriel would, of course, make the knights go to school. After Toriel would wake the two up, C would tell them to get ready for school while C would go start the car. Now, both of them would, of course, venture all throughout Chris's house while the knight is just witnessing Chris's reaction. Now, this would, of course, go the same as it would in deltarune. But once they would get to the car, Toriel would allow Chris to enter, but C would stop the knight before they would enter the car. Because Toriel would, of course, would see the knight's nail. Now, C would see how sharp it is, and C would tell the knight that they are not allowed to bring dangerous items within the school. So C would send the knight back into the house to dispose of their nail, and would tell them to come back after. Now, would the knight actually do this? No, they would not. They have devoted so much geo and materials to upgrade the nail into its final form. So the knight would, of course, trick Toriel by going into the house, but instead of throwing away the nail, they would hide the nail into their cloak and return to the car. Now, thanks to the knight's deceivery, they would, of course, all three of them would venture to the school, and Toriel would, of course, tell the knight how much they would possibly like the education system, even though we all know that the knight would despise the education system. But once they would get to the school, here's what I would think would happen. Now, I don't believe that the knight would be enrolled in Chris's class, because I believe in the funny headcanon that everyone thinks that the knight is a kid due to their size. So because of that, the knight would, of course, be enrolled in Toriel's classroom. So because of that, Chris would, of course, go into their classroom while the knight is dragged into Toriel's classroom and will be subjected to what I would possibly assume would be the equivalent to CIA torture. Now, because of that, the school day would, of course, go entirely the same as it would in the game. After a number of hours of unwanted education, the knight and their classmates will, of course, be finally let go out of school, but not without homework, which the knight has no idea what to do with. So, after wandering the halls for a brief second, the knight would, of course, catch the sight of Chris and Susie. Now, obviously, the knight would, of course, go up to the two, and Susie would, of course, recognize the knight, and she would be like, "Oh, it's you. Now, we're going to go to the closet if you want to join us." And the knight will, of course, obviously accept the invitation, because the knight needs to find a way back to Hollowness, or at least God home. So pretty much, the duo would, of course, become a trio, and all three of them would, of course, make their way to the closet. But before all three of them would, of course, enter the closet, they would, of course, be stopped by a female voice, and that voice belonged to Noelle. Now, before they would enter, Noelle would, of course, disturb them and wonder why all three of them are standing suspiciously around the closet. Now, obviously, they cannot just tell her that there is an entire other dimension behind the closet, because obviously they don't think that would, of course, be a very believable statement. So they would, of course, give a response, which would, of course, either be one of the two options in game. But whatever it is, Noelle just came to invite Chris and Susie, mainly Susie, to invite them to work on their projects together. Now, obviously, the knight has no idea who is in the school besides Chris and Susie, but of course, Noelle would, of course, notice the knight. Now, Noel wouldn't recognize the knight and wonder if they are a new student, but Noel would of course quickly find out that the knight is just as quiet as Chris, even though the knight would of course be way more quiet than Chris. But other than that, after a good brief moment of Noel and the knight having a staring contest, which Noel would have obviously lose, Noel would of course say, well, anyways, you two are invited to the computer lab to work on our projects while she would begin to leave. But before she leaves, she would of course hand Susie a box of chalk. Now, once she does, she would of course make her way to the local library and leave the three standing there and wondering what that gesture was about. Now, obviously the knight wouldn't really have an idea, and to be honest, I don't think that they would have really cared about it. But other than that, Susie would have the suspicion that she might be onto their secret identities. But other than that, they would turn around and reface the closet. And once they would open the closet and they would jump into the dark world. As they fall into the dark world, the clothes of Chris and Susie would of course change into their dark world forms, while the knight would remain in the same outfit as they were before. Once they would land, they would of course enter Castletown as it's still quiet as before. Eventually, after standing around for about 1 second, Rose would of course come rushing up to the three and of course greeting them. Now, Rose would of course greet them and say that he has never waited so long on Friends before, even though they have only been gone for about a day, or at least a quarter of a day and an entire night. But whatever, it has not been that long. So after Rose and Susie would of course chat for a bit, Susie would realize that they are the only group of people within Castletown. More importantly, the only people within this dark world. Now, Susie would of course ask Rose, where is everybody? Now, Rose would reveal that the people that was within the Card Kingdom technically no longer exist anymore, even because, well, the Card Kingdom no longer exists because Chris has returned light to that world. So, because of that, the people who dwelled within the Card Kingdom are now pretty much stuck in their light world forms, which is pretty much just the items within the empty classroom right next to the door. So Rose would instruct Chris to exit Castletown and collect every single piece of items that is within the room next to the closet and return everything to Castletown. Now, as Chris would of course be temporarily exiled to run this errand run, Rose would take this moment to learn a bit more about the knight. Now, here is the reason why Rose is doing this. Now, a bit of spoilers, but since this is a what if, I would of course assume that most of you would already assume that there would be spoilers. But anyways, Rose would do this because of the prophecy. Now, the thing about the prophecy is that the prophecy that Rose told our heroes last time was more of a summary than the whole ordeal, because Rose knows the entirety of the prophecy, but he noticed that there was a discrepancy with recent events. Pretty much the entirety of last adventure. And that discrepancy was the knight. Now, the prophecy stated that there would be 3 heroes. A human, a monster, and a prince of the dark. Not a 4th hero. So, Rose would be wondering, so what role is the knight filling? Are they filling the monster, or is there some other part of the prophecy that Rose has somehow looked over? But besides that, Rose would try their best to learn as much about the knight as they can. So pretty much, Rose would of course ask the knights where they have come from, but they would remember that the knight has no vocal cords. So pretty much they would of course just look at each other until Rose would break the silence by telling the knight that he appreciated everything that the knight has done so far for helping them throughout the adventure through Carter Kingdom and pretty much assisting them on being heroes. But of course, Rose would of course tell the knight that they are also a hero, just Rose has a bit of confusion in their voice. So other than that, Rose would of course tell the knight that they are welcome within Castletown as long as they need. So pretty much, Rose would of course be talking to the knight and to Susie, but eventually Chris would return with everything. Now, once Chris would return, Susie would ask, so where is everyone? But once Susie would finish her sentence, the entirety of Castletown would of course change in a blink of an eye. As Castletown would of course change, every person from Card Kingdom would of course now be in Castletown. But they would all quickly realize that almost everyone in Castletown right now is currently everyone that they pretty much was enemies against. But luckily, one of them was Lancer. Now, Lancer would of course reunite with Susie and the group, but Susie would of course ask, so hey Lancer, good to see you, but what happened to your castle? And Lancer would of course say that his castle is gone, completely gone, because since Chris returned light to the Dark World within Card Kingdom, pretty much the entirety of the world and every structure within it is now gone, even though Rose explained it a bit earlier. But Lancer pretty much says that he is now completely homeless. So Susie would of course wonder, well, where is Lancer gonna stay now? And pretty much Lancer says, let's go conquer Ross's castle, and runs off ahead. Now Lancer and the group would of course rush ahead, but the knight would of course stay behind a little bit, because the knight remembered one of his skills, and that skill was Dreamgate. Now, Dreamgate is an ability in Hollow Knight where the knight uses their Dream Nail to teleport to wherever they desire. Now, the knight would of course try to use the Dreamgate to return to Hollowness, but due to an unknown force, the knight would of course be unable to return from whence they came. So, out of frustration, the knight would of course return to the group. Now, since we are currently in Castletown, there is obviously a lot of things to do, but but for the sake of the what if, I'm going to cover the important parts. Now, before the group goes to Rose's castle, they would of course enter Psalm's shop. Now, Psalm was the shopkeeper to pretty much allow them to access the devil secret fight. But now, some, of course, would recognize the heroes and welcome them back. Now, they would, of course, talk and pretty much chat for a bit, but then they would reveal that they defeated Jebel. Now, some would, of course, be surprised that they even defeated Jebel, but he would be more surprised that Jebel had a dark crystal. Now, some would, of course, reveal the importance of these crystals. Now, some would say that if they would collect more of these crystals, some would, of course, be able to probably make something special for the group. Now, do we know what this item is? We only have a vivid idea of right now, but each party member would, of course, have their own idea of what this item would be. Now, the knight would, of course, believe that this item would be a new charm, but some would also warn our heroes that the beings who most likely hold the dark crystals would also most likely be tougher foes than they would usually face. So with the warning and with the information and with some items that they probably purchased, they would be sent on their way. Now, as they would make their way to Ralsei's castle, Ralsei would, of course, tell our heroes that the more people they would recruit, the more the town would grow. But since the knight is here and their violent tendencies, Ralsei suggests that they would, of course, try to be as peaceful as they could, and more importantly, as convincing as they could to try and recruit more people to Castletown. But eventually, they would, of course, make it to Ralsei's courtyard. Now, once they would, of course, reach the courtyard, they would enter Ralsei's castle. As they would enter the castle, Ralsei would, of course, go up to his cauldron and, of course, would bake everybody a cake to share. But once the cake would pop out of the cauldron, Susie would, of course, devour it all in one bite, even though the cake was meant to be shared amongst the four. Now, after that, Ralsei would reveal that he has a surprise for all three of them, and that surprise was rooms. Now, once they would, of course, go up to the upper level of the castle, they would see the rooms that Ralsei was going to surprise them with. Now, we already know what Chris's room looks like and what Susie's room looks like, but what would the knight's room look like? Now, after some consideration on my part, I made the brave assumption to imagine that their room would look like probably something from the City of Tears. So the knight would, of course, have a room similar to the architecture within the City of Tears, within Hollowness. But even though it may not exactly be the same from the City of Tears, it would, of course, have the vibe and, of course, would, of course, look like something from Hollowness. But regardless, Ralsei wanted all three of them to feel that this castle and Castletown a whole would be more like a second home from wherever they came from on Ralsei's part. But after inspecting their rooms and, of course, after inspecting some beds, they, of course, would eventually make their way to the dungeon and be greeted by a unfortunate familiar sight, and that sight was King. King would see our heroes, and he would wonder and ask, have they come to humiliate him any further? Ralsei would try to lighten the mood by asking if King would want to reconsider his position so that he might be able to live with the other residents of Castletown. But King would shut this offer down immediately because he finds it less humiliating than to rot in the cell rather than living in a kingdom ruled by the Lightners. But besides that, any other attempt to try to talk to King would of course shut it down by saying that he has nothing to discuss, because after all, they are the reason why he is in this cell, even though it was King's own action that landed him there. But before our heroes would leave the dungeon, King would stop all four of them by asking if his son Lancer is happy. Susie would wonder why King would even care, but King would see that his bluff was too effective on them, because if King were to do that, Lancer would of course bounce all the way back up to him, because Lancer is King's little bouncy boy. But besides that, our heroes would of course tell King that Lancer is doing fine, and they would all leave the dungeon. As our heroes would leave, King would of course be more interested in the fourth party member, the Knight. Now, I would assume that King would of course also know about the prophecy, and of course mainly the three main heroes, but the fact there is a fourth member in their party rather than just three members would also spark his interest, because King would of course believe that there is probably more to this unknown hero than meets the eye. After wandering around for a bit in the rest of Castletown, Chris would of course lead the party back to the entrance to the Dark World. Well, actually back to the entrance to Castletown. Now, when they would reach this point, Susie would ask that why are they there? Then, to Susie's unfortunate realization, she would ask Chris if they're really wanting to go and work on that project. And once Rose would hear this, he would ask if the three have homework, and because of that, Rose would not be happy about this and promptly banish all three of our heroes until they start their project. Now, and this would of course include the Knight, even though the Knight is not in the same class, but Rose doesn't know that, so the Knight is also banished. But before they were promptly kicked out, Lancer would of course invite himself into the party. Well, not into the party, but Lancer would of course join our heroes by going into Chris's pocket and entering and becoming an inventory item. Even though Rose didn't think this would be a good idea, but after Lancer would do that, Rose Card would also do the same, even though nobody wanted him to join in the first place, including the Knights. Now, before they could leave again, the original Starwalker would of course join the party and enter Chris's inventory. Now, Susie would want to leave before any other people get the same idea, so they would of course be banished and exit the Dark World. After exiting Castletown, our three heroes would of course realize, well, Chris and Susie would realize that they practically now have no choice but to do this school project. So Susie would of course say that we'll just tell Chris to let's just get this over with. So Chris and Susie would of course leave, and the Knight would of course try to use their Dream Nail again to attempt to return to Hollowness after Chris and Susie would of course gain some distance away from the Knight, but of course this would of course still end in failure. Now Susie would of course tell the Knight, well, she would ask the knights, are they coming or not? So pretty much the knight would go along with Chris and Susie, because if there is any way back to Hollowness, the best bet is have to do with probably the Dark Worlds. So the knights would of course follow Chris and Susie to the library and outside of the school. Now, once they would make it down towards the library, they would see a massive traffic jam, and also the sight of Undyne bench pressing a entire whole car with the person inside, of course. Now, Undyne would of course explain the traffic jam was caused by a certain someone, but she would also tell them that it's probably also dangerous for all three of them to be there, so she would tell the group to skedaddle or something bad would probably happen. Now, they would of course enter the library because it would probably be a good thing, because knowing the knight, they might try to challenge Undyne and, well, probably also challenge the caller, so it would be a good idea to enter the library at that point. Now, of course, when they would enter the library, they would of course notice there is a bit of a lack of people in the library. Now, of course, nowadays that's not really a strange thing, unfortunately. But for the sake, but of course, Chris and Susie would wonder where is Edwin, while the knight would of course inspect the library, because if there's anything that the knights would appreciate about this new world, it would of course be information. Now, this is where I'm going to say that the knights can of course understand what the people in the world of deltarune would say, but I'm not going to say that the knight would of course understand their written language. So when the knight would of course take one of the books, they would of course realize that they do not know how to read. So unfortunately, to the knight's frustration, they're not going to understand anything. Now, while the knight is inspecting the books, Chris and Susie would of course go up to the entrance to the computer lab, and they would of course open it to see a new Dark World. Now, of course, Susie would of course say, well, we can't do our project if, well, the entire computer lab is now a Dark World. Now, Chris would of course say that they have a computer at their own house. Now, Susie would of course will say, well, Chris, you're right, but unfortunately I'm your partner. So of course, while they would of course talk about the Dark World, the knight would of course go past the two of them and just jump in the Dark World. Now, of course, Chris and Susie would of course follow the knight, and this is where they would enter the cyber world. Now, the same thing would happen upon entering the cyber world. The appearance of Susie and Chris would change, while the knights would of course remain the same as they ever were. But when they would land into the new Dark World, they would of course see the vast difference immediately, because unlike Castletown, this world is a lot more cybernetic. Now, they would of course venture into the outskirts of the cyber field, and they would of course be greeted with the same eerie silence, of course, of the Dark World, as just like they first experienced when they in their first adventure. Now, of course, they would of course enter. Well, not enter. They would of course see the Plug Boys. Still don't know why that's their name, but I'm going with it. So they would of course interact with the Darkners, and they would of course tell them about, well, what just happened. Now, they would give a few warnings, but our heroes would of course venture further in. Now, they would of course come across the electric wire obstacle. So the knight would of course just dash right through it while Chris and Susie would navigate through it. But once they would of course make it out of there, they would of course be greeted with a familiar sight, and that was the sight of Noelle. Now, Noelle would be on her knees pleading for help, but she would of course quickly recognize the trio. Now, she would warn all three of them to get out of there, but before she could do anything, she would of course be trapped in a cage and taken away. Now, due to the suddenness, I'm going to assume that the knights couldn't really do anything because, well, because what just happened would have been so fast. So for the story, let's just say Noelle would still be captured. Now, before they could try to free Noelle, Noelle would be taken away, and they would of course hear a very regal laugh, and that laugh belonged to none other than Queen. Now, Queen would of course greet our heroes. Queen would introduce herself to our heroes by her serial number, but she would simplify it by asking them to call her Queen. Now, Susie wouldn't want to call her Queen, but she would also fail badly to pronounce her full serial number. So Queen would of course tell Susie to call her Queen by summoning another Queen pop-up. Now, Susie would tell Queen that they are not children, but Queen would correct Susie by saying that teens are much bigger children, and she would also assume that the knight is their pet bug, and the knight only has a repetitive brain function, so Queen would also assume that the knight is very stupid. So she would try to retort Queen by saying that wouldn't that make her stupid too, but Queen would come back to Susie by telling her that she is a computer, so she is instantly smart, and most likely the smartest person to ever lived. I added that last part, but pretty much their banter would be stopped by Susie asking why she even captured Noelle. Now, Queen would say that she will make Noelle her winning peon, and possibly turn her face into a robot, and also she also wants to take over the world because it's cool. Now, obviously, not going to allow Queen to do that. Now, Queen would ask our heroes if they want to fight, and obviously the knight would hit Queen with a challenge pose, but Queen would of course say, well then, fight. And now, Queen would of course try to fly away, but unfortunately for Queen, the knight would be able to sneak in a vengeful spirit and hitting her chair and also damaging it. Now, while Queen would try to regain control of her chair, she would also summon 2 werewires, well, maybe 3 werewires, to stall our heroes from possibly catching up to her. Now, since this is the first battle, I would assume that since Rosie's not here, it's going to be a bit challenging for Chris and Susie, but luckily for the knight is a nail master, so while Chris and Susie handle the werewire's attention, the knight would instantaneously cut off the wires and free the darkness that were under Queen's control. Now, because of that, they would try to catch up to Queen because hopefully to them, she possibly crashed her chair and possibly is on her feet now. But before they could try to catch up to Queen, they would be immediately greeted with a new pack of werewires. Now, before they could even try to fight them, they would be graciously bailed out of that situation by Rosie's pacify spell. Now, once the freed werewires would of course be gone away, they would be greeted with a much nicer encounter, which is Ralsei. Now, Ralsei would of course go up to our heroes and greet them and tell them that he had felt a dark presence and made his way over to this dark world. Now, does he explain how he does this? Nope, no he does not. That is still one of the greatest mysteries to this day and at this point of time. Now, they would of course be happy to see Ralsei, and of course Suzy would say that nothing beats a good adventure, so they would of course be reunited and strike their group pose. Now, after they strike their group pose, they would of course venture forth into the deep cyber fields. Now, pretty much, they would of course look at the great scenery, and they would dodge some obstacles, and of course they would fight some of the enemies that they would encounter. Now, the battles would not really be that bad since the knight and Ralsei is there, so pretty much they would just breeze past them. Now, eventually they would of course catch up the Queen. Now, Queen wouldn't really be too happy that her chair is kind of destroyed, but luckily she has spares. So, but before she would notice our heroes, she would be trying to convince Noelle to be a willing peon. Is this working? No, it's not. So, they would of course tell Queen to free Noelle, and they would not let her turn Noelle's face into a robot. Now, Noelle would be surprised that this is what Queen is trying to do, and Queen would say, well, that was supposed to be a surprise. But before Noelle could ask any more questions, Queen would send her away. Now, obviously the knight still wants to fight Queen, so the knight would still try to attack Queen, but for the sake of the story, Queen would keep the knight at bay with bug spray. Now, before they could do anything else, she would tell the heroes to wait. Now, pretty much, Queen would ask if they would want to be their willing peons, because if she's gonna have willing peons, they must have the willing part. Now, obviously, they're not going to choose that, so Queen would do the next best thing. If she can't humiliate them directly, she will humiliate them via video game. So, she would summon one of her SWATlings, and they would bring a giant arcade machine. Now, pretty much, none of our heroes can actually properly play the game by themselves, because none of them are tall enough, especially our knight. Now, pretty much, eventually they figured out, so if they're going to beat Queen at this video game, they're pretty much going to have to form a human tower thing. Pretty much they all stack onto each other, so pretty much Ralsei's a stool, Susie's a support, and Chris is pretty much the pilot. So pretty much you're seeing it on screen. But what would the knight do? So two things. So the knight is either going to stand there, or the knight is just going to probably cling on the back of Susie's back with their mantis claws and pretty much be a silent watch. Just pretty much the knight is just going to be a audience member, pretty much. So the knight's just gonna be a very silent backseat gamer. So other than that, the arcade segment would just really go the same way. So they would beat Queen, and so after they defeat Queen and after the knight's live reaction, Queen would once again offer our heroes to either join her or perish. Now, obviously, they would choose the Paris and oppose Queen, so Queen would of course go on her merry way. Now, the knights non-visibly aggravated by being held at bay by a bug spray, but all four of them would continue on towards their goal. Now, they would of course venture on, and they would encounter a force field which is blocking their way. Now, they would of course decide to try and find a way to deactivate it, but also there are two shopkeepers who are offering to, well, they're pretty much wanting to sell 400 bagels. Now, unfortunately for our heroes, with their combined strength, they will not be able to carry that many amounts of bagels, so they would of course continue. Now, obviously they would encounter the hacker. Now, pretty much the hacker wants our heroes to collect 3 blue check marks. So they would agree, and they would pretty much continue on further. So as they would venture on, they would of course solve more puzzles, and they would of course encounter the task. Now, thanks to the knight's strength, they would of course be driven off, but pretty much with enough blue check marks, and pretty much, well, we're not there yet. So eventually they would venture on, and they would reach the teacups ride. After riding all 3 teacups, they would of course eventually find the right one. Now, after riding the right one, they would of course step onto a platform, and they would encounter Sweet. Now, Sweet would of course try to stop our heroes while they were temporarily cornered. But of course, the platform would reach its destination, and Sweet would of course be the one at a dead end. Now, with all 4 of our heroes cornering Sweet would of course call upon his friends. Now, Sweet, Captain, and KK would of course come to Sweet's aid, and they would pretty much claim that our 4 heroes are working with Queen, and they are the last resistance against her. Now, Susie would of course try and tell the 3 that they are actually working against Queen, but unfortunately, to the 3, they would of course start bickering, and as of course they were to bicker, and eventually they would start bickering amongst themselves, our heroes would of course start to lose interest. Now, before our heroes could walk away, the 3 members of the resistance would of course start a battle. Now, pretty much, since this is I don't want to call it a boss battle, but it kind of is, so let's just say this is a mini boss battle. I don't know. So pretty much, since Sweet, Captain, KK are so determined to fight our heroes, the knights would get an idea. So the knights would of course go up to our 3 heroes, and this is where the knights would give them their charms. Now, I have decided to give our heroes these 3 charms. Rose would of course get Spell Twister, because knowing how Rose is mainly the support member of the group, and he's pretty much the main sorcerer. Spell Twister is a charm that heavily reduces the cost of casting magic, and knowing how good Rose's healing spell is, Rose would pretty much become busted at this point. So Rose would be given Spell Twister, so now Rose can pretty much just spam heal prayer at any point in a battle with enough TP. Now, Susie was a very interesting choice. Well, by interesting I mean pretty much I had a lot of decisions to give to Susie when it comes to charms. Now, I have decided to give Susie Unbreakable Strength. Now, knowing how strong Susie is, and Susie's pretty much the main powerhouse of the base 3, I decided that one of the smart decisions to give her a charm would pretty much be Unbreakable Strength. Now, Unbreakable Strength was originally Fragile Strength. Now, Fragile Strength used to be if you die, in Hollow Knight, the charm would pretty much shatter. But thanks to the Grim Troop and that one member in the Grim Troop, Fragile Strength became Unbreakable Strength, and pretty much Susie is now way more stronger than she was. Now, I'm not saying that Susie would become One Punch Man, but Susie would pretty much be a bit more stronger than she would, of course, be. Now, then we have Chris. Now, when I was deciding what charm to give Chris, it came down to either giving Chris Nail Master's Glory or giving Chris Mark of Pride. But knowing what's coming in the future, I think Mark of Pride would be the smarter option. So pretty much Mark of Pride gives the user more attack range. So pretty much Chris now has a long sword instead of a broadsword. Now, with the knight giving these charms, the knight will of course take these charms back once this adventure is over, because I do not believe that the knight would just simply allow the three to just keep the charms until, well, pretty much longer than they are needed. So the knight would give each member a silent look of "I'm expecting these to be given back to me," while he's giving the three their charms. So after this brief pause in the battle, they would of course start going on to the battle. So pretty much in this fight, pretty much you're supposed to get each member of Sweet Captain KK's resistance dancing, but this is pretty much where Ross would introduce the action. So pretty much how it would work, so how I see this battle going in this what if is, the knight would of course not be so merciful, but thanks to Ross, the knights would of course not completely beat him up, but Sweet Captain KK would of course still get roughed up a bit. But thanks to R action and S action, each member of the resistance, and so pretty much everyone started dancing, and pretty much the knights would of course just stand there. Now, after the resistance was pretty much defeated, well, mercifully defeated, well, kinda defeated, I should say, Sweet Captain KK would pretty much say that they have reached a stalemate, and since they are not directly working with Queen, they propose that both sides should have a temporary alliance, and they would of course ask them to rendezvous to their headquarters. Now, as the three would leave, they would of course, the knight and the hero and Chris and the gang would of course venture back through the cyberfield. Now, as they would make their way to the headquarters of the resistance, they would of course return to the hacker and of course give the hacker his blue check mark. Now, the hacker would of course award our heroes with a light show of their faces. Now, pretty much they would of course go towards the headquarters and also witness the scenery of the city and the fireworks show. But eventually they would reach the resistance headquarters. Now, it turns out the headquarters is just a shop. Now they would of course enter, and so here's the thing, right? Now, since Chris is pretty much the person who pays for everything, I don't think the knight would attempt to use Geo again, because knowing how Sham back in chapter 1 really didn't accept that as a currency, and seeing how Chris is mainly paying for everyone, the knight is just going to allow Chris to just pay for whatever he's giving. Now, I believe Chris would, of course, buy some few items. Now, just like I said, I'm not allowing the knight to have new weapons, well, and pretty much, I guess, armor as well. So pretty much, Chris can attempt to buy some armor pieces, but I don't think the knight would probably accept it, because let's just say for more reasons, it would probably slow their movement down. So Chris would buy some healing items and whatever they need for the party. But they would also chat with Sweet Captain and KK. Now, pretty much, they would reveal that Queen was already bad before, but since the Dark Fountain showed up, and of course, well, this knight showed up, Queen has gotten way worse. And they would also talk about her music taste as well, but pretty much they would just reveal that Queen has pretty much gone a complete mad monarch, and C's kinda got to go. So with all that said, our heroes would of course continue on their journey. Now, pretty much they would make their way through the final part of the cyber field. Now, they would of course encounter some of the enemies, and they would of course deal with them, with the knight being, of course, the lead attacker. Now, after they would of course deal with some of the enemies, I wouldn't put a past for I'll say to ask the knight to be a bit more merciful, but the thing is, knowing how the knight practically survived all of Hollowness, I wouldn't really blame the knight for, well, being the knight. Now, pretty much, they would of course reach the teacup rides up towards the roller coaster. Now, after surviving the teacup ride, they would of course enter the roller coaster. Now, each one of them would of course enter their own coaster cart. Now, since each roller coaster is pretty much themed after their rider, and well, unfortunately, I'm not an artist, so I can't really make a cart. So let's just say that. So happily, there is a robotic stag for the knight to ride. Now, once every party member would of course their form of transportation on the roller coaster, they would of course set out towards the Dark Fountain. Now, Rose would see that this fountain, well, not the fountain itself, but the roller coaster might lead them straight towards the Dark Fountain itself. So they all of course would continue to ride the roller coaster until they were stopped. Now, they were stopped by none other than Queen, riding a new flying chair. Well, throne. But anyways, so C would of course tell the heroes that C has been too merciful so far, so she would of course try and capture all four of them, completely missing them in the process. Now, C would of course say that this was a tactical calculation or something along the lines of that, but pretty much she would of course reveal a new plot twist, and that was Noelle. Now, Susie would of course be surprised to see Noelle here, but Noelle would of course reveal that Queen gave her an offer that she couldn't really refuse. Now, so this would of course go just like normal. So Susie and Noelle would of course start to talk and also compliment each other, but Queen would get bored of this and she would bring in the next willing peon, and that was Birdly. Now, unlike Noelle, Queen wasn't really too hesitant to, well, make Birdly one of her peons, but seeing the circumstances, she unfortunately had to make him a part of her team. So, Birdly has become her very unintentional knight. So pretty much, Burley would of course tell Noelle that he will be her knight in shining armor and protect her from the heroes. Now, pretty much, Burley sees no value of recruiting Susie or Rose, but luckily for Chris and the knights, he sees value in them. Now, Burley would of course go on about how he would assist Queen in taking over the world and making it a Smartopia. But if Chris would of course join their side, Burley would give them the royal pleasure of scrubbing the royal toilet. Now, Burley, seeing the knight, would offer the knight, if the knight were to join Burley, he will make the knight his squire. Now, unknowing to Burley, the knight has the king's brand, which makes them the king of Hollow Nest. Pretty much already is a knight. And pretty much the knight is practically everything that Burley claims to be. So obviously the knight is going to turn down this offer. So seeing that they are going to decline Burley's offer, this would of course begin the boss fight against Burley. Now, how the fight would go is pretty much the heroes have to try to bump Burley's coaster until Burley is knocked off the roller coaster. So the thing is, right, so this is where we would compare Burley's attacks against the knight. Now, well, pretty much this is where we compare the knight against Burley. Now, Burley has 3 main attacks. Now, there is his tornado attack, there is his halberd attack, and there is his it's his paper attack, I just remembered. But pretty much those are his 3 main attacks. But with the knight, so the knight can of course, well, shade dash through the tornadoes, and seeing that the knight has, well, the fully upgraded Pyraneo, I can fully well assume that the knight can, well, just slash right through the paper. I think the spear attack would be tricky for the knight because, well, it's his first time seeing it, but once the knight would of course get it down and memorize, I think the knight can pretty much also dash right through it and pretty much can handle it. But how I would see the boss fight going is, since the heroes now have charms, they would of course be way more effective, and the boss fight wouldn't really last that long as it would seem. So how the fight would go is, since the knight has Crystal Dash and is pretty much since on a roller coaster track, the knight cannot just hop off the stag and of course run up to Burley, because, well, then the knight would of course get trampled. So luckily for Crystal Dash, that one of his abilities, the knight can of course dash right onto Burley's cart, and the knight would of course force Burley to actually resort to one-on-one combat up front. Now, since the knight is more experienced in combat, Burley would be quickly overwhelmed. Now, seeing that Burley's attention is solely on the knight, the 3 heroes would of course take their chance and continuously bump onto Burley's cart. Now, this would of course go on for a few minutes, but with enough grit and effort, our heroes would of course defeat Burley, and Burley would of course be sent skydiving off of the roller coaster. Now, after Burley's cart would of course explode. The knight would of course return to their stag just by the skin of their non-existent teeth and land right back on their seat. Now, after that performance, Queen would return to inform our heroes that the roller coaster is not exactly finished. So they would ask, so what would that mean? And then Queen would tell them that would of course mean pain, and they would of course be sent flying off on cue, while all 4 of our heroes would of course fall right down into Cyber City. And this is where we will fade to black, because this is the end of part 1. Now, if you made it this far into this video, I would like to thank you, because it has taken me probably 7 different attempts to just make What If the Night Was in Deltarune Chapter 2 in general, but I believe this time I finally got it. But unfortunately I had to split this up into parts. Now with a few other things left to say, I know a part of this, in this part, it's pretty much me just recapping the base events of Deltarune. Well, pretty much the base events of Chapter 2 in its beginning, but I'm very certain that in the following parts is where we get to see the knight heavily change the story of Chapter 2. Now, of course, I have to also mention, I do not own Hollow Knight or Deltarune in general. They have been made by both of their separate creators. And of course, that also goes the same with their music, but other than that, thank you for watching, and this video is Captain Bones approved.